I know how it looks from the outside. A message appears on your screen. It could be simple, a question, an invitation, a few words from someone you care about. And yet, instead of replying immediately, you stare at it. You read it once, then again. Maybe you put your phone down and tell yourself you'll answer later. Minutes pass, sometimes hours, sometimes longer. And while other people may assume you are uninterested, distracted, or avoiding them, the truth is often much quieter than that. Because for you, replying is not always just replying. It is processing. It is feeling. It is finding the emotional space to step into a conversation fully. Some people move through communication almost automatically. A message comes in, a response goes out. Like breathing, like turning a familiar key in a familiar lock. But not everyone experiences communication that way. For some people, every message asks for a small emotional investment. Not because the conversation is difficult. Not because the person is unwanted. But because attention itself feels valuable. And valuable things are rarely spent without thought. Psychologically, people who need time before replying are often carrying a stronger awareness of interpersonal responsibility. When they answer, they want to answer properly. They do not want their words to feel careless. They do not want to misunderstand. They do not want to send something they will later wish they had phrased differently. So instead of reacting immediately, they pause. From the outside, that pause can look like distance. Inside, it often looks like consideration. The strange thing is that modern communication was built for speed. Messages arrive instantly. Notifications expect instant attention. The technology moves faster than many nervous systems were designed to move. And for people who process emotions deeply, this creates a quiet tension. Because a message is never just a message. A message can represent expecta. Tions, responsibilities, relationships, unspoken emotions, sometimes even memories. A simple "how are you" may seem small to one person. To another, it can feel like opening a door that leads into a much larger room, a room filled with thoughts they have not yet organized, feelings they have not yet named, energy they are not sure they have available today. So they wait, not because they do not care, because they care enough to notice the wait. Many people who take longer to reply are also highly sensitive to emotional atmosphere. They pay attention to tone, context, subtle meanings hidden between words. Their minds naturally search for emotional details that others might overlook. This can make communication richer, but it can also make communication heavier. A conversation that looks like a pebble from the outside can feel like a stone carried in the pocket all day. And over time, this creates a pattern. The phone lights up, the message is seen, the mind be. Jin's processing, the response is imagined, rewritten, adjusted, delayed, not because the answer does not exist, because too many possible answers exist at once. What makes this even more confusing is that many of these people genuinely enjoy connection. They want relationships. They value closeness. They think about people often. Yet there can be a gap between feeling connected and having enough emotional energy to express that connection immediately. Imagine emotional energy as a blanket. Some days it feels warm, thick, and abundant. There is enough to wrap around everyone. Other days it feels small, barely enough to cover yourself. On those days, even a friendly conversation can feel like something that requires more warmth than you currently have available. And so the message waits, not rejected, just waiting for the moment when the emotional blanket feels large enough again. Halfway through understanding this behavior, an important realization appears: the Dell. AY is often not a sign of disconnection. It is frequently a sign that the person experiences connection as something meaningful enough to require emotional presence. That changes the entire picture, because what appears like indifference can sometimes be the opposite. What appears like distance can sometimes be care moving at a slower speed. This tendency often begins early in life. As children, some people learn to observe before participating. They become the quiet readers of emotional rooms, the ones who notice tensions, the ones who sense moods, the ones who think before speaking. Their inner world becomes detailed and active. Reflection feels natural. Pause feels safe. Then adolescence arrives, and communication starts becoming more complicated. Friendships deepen, social expectations multiply. Every interaction begins carrying more emotional significance. For someone who already processes things deeply, messages can start feeling like tiny crossroads. Every reply becomes a choice. Every choice becomes something to think about. By adulthood, the pattern often evolves again. Responsibilities increase. Work demands attention. Relationships require maintenance. Life becomes crowded with invisible obligations. And suddenly, messages are no longer arriving in an empty space. They are arriving inside a mind already balancing dozens of concerns. At this stage, delayed responses are often less about anxiety and more about conservation. People are quietly managing emotional resources, protecting attention, trying to stay present in a world that constantly asks for more presence than anyone can realistically give. This is why many people feel guilty when they take time to respond. They know others may interpret the silence personally. They know the expectations surrounding communication. They know what instant availability has come to symbolize. And yet another part of them knows something equally important. They know that forced connection. Section rarely feels like genuine connection, so they wait until they can arrive emotionally, until they can be present, until they can respond as themselves instead of from autopilot. Autopilot works well for many things: driving familiar roads, following routines, completing repetitive tasks, but meaningful communication often asks for something different. It asks for attention, and attention cannot always be summoned on demand. For people who need time before replying, conversations often feel less like transactions and more like entering a home. You do not rush into a home without noticing where you are. You step inside, you look around, you settle in, you become present. Only then do you fully arrive. Messages can feel the same way. There is another layer hidden underneath all of this. Sometimes delayed responses are connected to a desire for emotional safety, not fear exactly, not avoidance exactly, something gentler. The desire to meet people from a place that feels authentic, a familiar room inside themselves, a place where their words feel true, a place where they can recognize their own voice. And when life becomes noisy, finding that room can take time. So they wait at the doorway until they can hear themselves again. Perhaps that is why this behavior is often misunderstood. We tend to measure communication by speed, but speed and sincerity are not always the same thing. Some people communicate quickly, some communicate carefully. Neither is inherently better. They are simply different ways of moving through relationships. The person who replies instantly is not necessarily more caring. The person who replies later is not necessarily less caring. Human connection is far more complicated than timestamps, and maybe that is the most important thing to remember. If you are someone who needs time before replying, there is a chance you have spent years wondering whether something is wrong with you, whether you are too small, too sensitive, too difficult, too much. But perhaps what is happening is simpler than that. Perhaps your mind was never built to treat every interaction as disposable. Perhaps your attention naturally moves with intention. Perhaps your emotional world asks for a little more space before words can leave it. And maybe that space is not a flaw. Maybe it is simply part of how you move through connection, like an anchor lowering slowly into deep water, like a blanket gathered carefully around your shoulders, like returning to a familiar room inside yourself before opening the door for someone else. Not everyone will understand that rhythm, but it remains a rhythm nonetheless, and there is nothing wrong with being someone whose care arrives thoughtfully, quietly, and in its own time.